Administrative Performance Panel for Education, and ask if we've got any apologies for absence.
We have no apologies today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Are there any disclosures of personal and prejudicial interests?
The one I normally say, my son works for the Education Department in Swansea.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sue. Obviously, there's a
Lyndon, sorry, can I do a roll call if that's okay?
Absolutely, yeah, go on, yeah.
Okay, we'll start with you, Lyndon. Lyndon Jones.
Yes.
Cyril Anderson. Mike Day.
Yes, miss.
Mike Turk. Stephen Gallagher.
Yes.
David Halliwell.
Present.
Bev Hopkins.
Present.
Linda James.
Yes.
Susan Jones.
Yes.
Miles Langstone.
Yes.
And Linda Tyler Lloyd. Also, Dave Anderson Thomas. I think I saw him there, Dave. And Alexander Roberts.
Hello, yes.
Hello.
We also have.
It's Councillor Mike Dirk. It is. I'm here now. I just missed my name.
Lovely. Take you off the list.
Thank you.
And also Councillor Jennifer Rayner, Cabinet Member, and Helen Morgan-Rees, Director.
Okay, great. Thanks. Could we mute everybody and then come in as you, use the hands up sign or come in during the course of, so we'll stop these some of the background noise. Great, thanks.
You'll have to unmute yourself. You'll have to unmute.
There we go. Right. I mentioned the prohibition of whip votes and declaration of party whips. The next item on the agenda are letters and minutes. Could I have a proposer with regard to the minutes that they be accepted as a true record? It's Mike Day and seconder.
Yes.
Miles Langston. There we go. Great. Thanks very much. Public questions. Are there any public questions, Michelle?
No, there are no public questions today.
Okay, great, excellent. That's and the next item on the agenda is really a verbal update. So we're racing through very quickly. And could I ask and welcome Helen Morgan-Rees, our Acting Director of Education, and if you'd like to give us the verbal update.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, happy to do so. So as much as we thought we'd recovered last term in terms of education, obviously the current position we find ourselves in is still a volatile one for education. So our recovery plan in terms of our schools is currently hampered really by the pandemic. But that's not to say that our other strategies in education are developing during this time. So if I give you the school's position, and then I'll touch upon some of the other work we've been focusing on in education as well. So as you probably are aware, our schools are open for on-site learning for vulnerable children only, and those of critical workers. The regulations changed on the 18th of December after we met before Christmas to state clearly that there was quite a wide-ranging list of critical workers that we have to have due regard for. But that's not to say that we can accommodate all of those critical worker children on site for learning at this time, because we obviously have to risk assess our premises and the number of staff available to actually provide learning. So if you remember, during the first lockdown, we had childcare for our critical workers, or key workers as they were first called. Now we have a scenario where it is very much about learning. So we can't deprive them of learning if they attend on site in schools. Our vulnerable children at this time are obviously those who are most in need in terms of the risk of harm if they stay at home. So our starting point is that it's safer for children to be at home currently during this Tier 4 lockdown period, and that we would discourage really the use of on-site learning where possible. So we've switched back to our remote learning offer, and I need to make it very clear that during this time there are national expectations for exam year groups. So when we look at years 10, 11, 12 and 13 across our schools, there is a national expectation for 4 hours a day of synchronous learning. However, for other year groups across our schools, there is no such expectation nationally, and indeed from the local authorities' perspective, we're not prescribing what schools should be doing. The reason for that is that we have diverse communities. We believe that our head teachers know their communities best. They know what kind of blended learning or remote learning offer should be provided. So for some schools that works well on a synchronous basis. For some year groups it works well where there are live synchronous lessons. But for most of our learners across Swansea, I think a blend of recorded lessons, a few live lessons, some paper packs and workbooks, that produces a good blend according to their age and their aptitude. So further to that, we have enhanced our Swansea virtual school. So you will be aware during the first lockdown period back in March and during the spring and summer terms last year, we created a new virtual school for Swansea, and we have reviewed and updated that during this current period, during the start of this spring term. In terms of our devices, in terms of digital learning and digital inclusion, we have actually invested through our infrastructure project more than £5 million worth of investment in terms of both kit and cabling in our schools. And to date, we've actually delivered over 8,000 devices to our schools in Swansea. And on top of that, we've got nearly 2,000 being prepared to go to schools, to our primary schools currently. And we are awaiting a delivery of a further 2,000 devices. So that's considerable in terms of the digital investment and ensuring that there's accessibility for our families. As I've said before, and there's some overlap here, if you attended the Policy Development Committee, you will have heard me say that it's not perfect, and we will continue to monitor the situation because we are aware that some families have not got the most appropriate devices, and there are children who are sharing devices still. So we will continue to monitor the situation, but we are very proud really of that achievement in ensuring accessibility. I'll stop there because there's a question.
Good. Thanks, Helen. Is it okay to ask a question now, Lyndon, or do you want to leave them to the end? Yeah. Okay. Just in terms of the devices, Helen, the devices that you're taking delivery of and have taken delivery of, they're all brand new devices. Is there any scope for refurbishing equipment? I know one or two people have contacted me to say, look, I've got a spare computer which, you know, isn't being used. Is it possible to kind of donate it to anybody in need? Is there any kind of demand that you've been able to identify which would be satisfied by that sort of offer?
Certainly, we're still hearing of cases where devices are needed. They're few and far between now. We did have internally a small stockpile of old devices within the council, within the education department, and we were able to repurpose those, but that stockpile has been exhausted. If there are private donations, you know, families wanting to donate to schools, that's acceptable. In our secondary schools, there are technicians on site that can actually prepare the devices suitably. That's not the case in primary schools. So we would need potentially to be cautious in terms of accepting donations privately from families wanting to donate or members of the community wanting to donate. So it's not to say we can't do it, but we'd have to exercise caution.
So if anybody offers, Helen, is it possible to identify a point that they can make contact with? I agree with what you're saying in terms of them having to be cleaned and make sure that they've got the appropriate software on and so on. So with the secondary schools, it sounds like the best approach would be to go to the secondary schools to offer. But with the primary schools, is there a kind of central point that people could contact?
Yes, if you use the education email address, so that's education@swansea.gov.uk, then we can allocate to the appropriate officers who can look into the situation. So yes, happy to accept the offers, but no guarantee they'll be accepted. Okay, so just to move on in terms of the announcement yesterday around examinations and assessments in our schools, you'll know by now that the assessment for this summer term will be in the form of teachers assessing within their schools. I haven't been briefed myself yet on what this actually means, but from what I've seen, it would mean that pupils would be assessed according to mock examinations, past papers, and that's as much as we know so far. So in terms of training our teachers really around the expectations for these assessed grades in schools, we'll probably need a little bit more in-depth detail. I haven't got that with me today, but we'll find out. I know there are seminars this evening, so we'll find out exactly what the score is, but you'll know that there are no examinations, and the planned proposals, the alternative proposals for assessments have now been scrapped. So it's really assessments within schools and not external assessment or tests at all. So that's an update in terms of our exam year groups. You will have heard about vaccination. I'll pause there because I know Councillor Rayner would like to possibly come in.
Thank you very much, Helen. As you're aware, the announcement about the assessments, the alternative for the examinations was made yesterday afternoon at 3. Subsequent papers have come out which have given us a little more guidance. It's not just up to every school to decide exactly how they will do it. Our understanding is that Qualifications Wales and the WJEC will assist by providing an assessment framework, which will give the first stage of standardisation. Thereafter, there will be a degree of moderation across schools and across pupils. So looking forward to more detail. One, we can assure students there's not going to be what sounded like the old scheme, which was half an exam. But there is going to be work on progress, and there's more planning going into it than there was last year with the sudden abandonment of the strange results that came out of the formula. So we will keep you updated as information comes out. I know that the Welsh Government is trying to update as many heads and teachers as they can, but given the number across Wales, that's quite a challenge on anybody's digital learning platform.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jen. Before Helen carries on, Al, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Lynn. And yeah, no, it was just about the PCs and the IT side of things. And perhaps this isn't the forum to discuss it, but it seems like that, everyone across the UK, council-wise, will be addressing this shortfall as a result of digital poverty, or however you want to describe this situation. Even when families are very well provisioned in terms of devices under normal circumstances, when you've got the weight of use that suddenly has risen, then there's a shortfall. And whether or not you characterise that as digital poverty or not, I don't know. But certainly there is a shortfall, there is a gap. And I just wondered whether or not there's any conversation that could take place or be instigated by us as an authority to lead on this at a national level, as a national discussion about how this type of situation would pan out down the road if something like this were to occur. It's entirely probable that another pandemic of this type will occur in the future, and it's more likely now. We've been through this, and we can see how easy it is for everything to crumble in terms of infrastructure. So I haven't got the fix, I haven't got the answers, but to start a conversation along those lines as part of those well-being for future generations, perhaps activities, would seem to be like a good idea. I don't know if there's been any thoughts at your end, please, Helen.
Yeah, I would say that our infrastructure programme was in place, that strategy was in place before COVID. So there are certain waves to this strategy in terms of progress, and we have our digital lead in education, Chris Rees, who you may have met. And Chris is actually involved in a working group with Welsh Government currently, looking at the situation very closely. So we've got really good links with Welsh Government in terms of what this pandemic means for us now, in terms of that digital device scenario, but also for the future. So we are working closely with Welsh Government on these matters.
Thank you for that answer. Do you know if that conversation includes a discussion about free broadband provision, perhaps for all primary school and secondary school pupils? You know, a conversation along those lines, bearing in mind what's been in the papers recently and the press around, you know, telecoms providers suddenly going, "Hey, we'll give this stuff out." So they've done very well out of the pandemic, haven't they? And I know this came up in Scrutiny earlier on in the week. So do you know if that discussion includes that type of subject matter?
I can't account totally if that conversation is actually happening in terms of broadband providers, because there are more than one provider. But there are certainly opportunities to broaden and widen the discussion beyond the current situation we find ourselves in. My understanding is the main thrust of the conversation has been about connectivity and providing, you know, dongles, MiFi dongles for that purpose. So to widen that discussion is a very good point, well made, and I think there's an opportunity for us to do it when the time is right.
Talk about.
Great, thank you. Helen, back to you.
Could I just come in on this point?
Yeah, sure.
There has been discussion within the WLGA, because initially we all saw the publicity from the companies saying, we will do this, we will do that. The first one was BT, who made the offer in England, but that was for a very slow form of broadband. We couldn't have done downloading of even recorded lessons at that level of speed. We are in constant dialogue with the companies about this. As you're aware, the Welsh Government emphasis has been on the MiFi dongles, which come preloaded and can provide quite hefty downloads when required. The other element that appears to be emerging from the offer from the commercial companies is trying to transfer people from the pay-as-you-go model, which is the most attractive for some of our poorer communities, onto monthly contracts. Well, some of those have already fallen out of, defaulted, realised they couldn't sustain that with all the other funding pressures. So it remains an interesting offer, but it's a bit like watching the emergence of food vouchers in England. Let's just see how it really pans out and let them discover the small print.
Great, thanks. Cyril, you've got a question.
Yeah, I had two questions. Jen just answered my second question. Ellen, you say 8,000 devices are already out there and 2,000 waiting. Can you tell me how many children are still waiting for devices? Would you be able to tell me?
At this point in time, it's very difficult. We did submit a survey in, and I haven't got those figures to hand today, but we did share some of those figures with the PDC recently, Policy Development Committee. So I'd have to remind myself and submit them back to this panel. But certainly we had, I think it was about a fortnight ago, we had, I'm guessing, it was close to 2,000 learners who had inappropriate devices. It's not to say they didn't have anything, but they may have had a gaming console or something that was not quite fit in the bill, but it didn't mean they weren't accessing any learning at all. So you will know that some of our families have got lots of gaming devices in their homes, and many of our head teachers have simply purchased a keyboard to link into some of those devices. Not sure how it works myself, but those devices then have been repurposed to allow access, but they're not probably the most appropriate devices. So by now, this is a fortnight hence, I think that number is much reduced, because we have received additional stock, particularly in our secondary schools. And the devices we've got, nearly 2,000 of them waiting to go out. There's a trickle of that happening as we speak. So I can't really quote the figure at the moment. I'd have to find out.
Could you let us have those figures,
Can I-
possibly? And sorry,
Yeah, can I just go and say, Jen sent out a thing on Xbox, and I put it out on Facebook, and I tell you what, I had quite a few hits and comments saying, well done, you know, so well done on you as well. I know this is scrutiny, but we got to give thanks when it's deserved.
No, it's a learning curve, I tell you, because as we've said all along, really, the work of the teachers and the head teachers and the education staff they've had to almost reinvent themselves over the last number of months, and gosh, you know, they've done a great job. Helen, if you could let us have those figures, though, and the other thing is, which it's concerned to this committee, I know, is how many people on free school meals haven't actually got devices, because we really need to give them a big helping hand.
Yeah, certainly, Chair. We'll try and dig deep into those figures, and I'm hoping they're few and far between by now, because we've done our monitoring, we've supplied the demand, really. In terms of the recovery, obviously where digital inclusion is concerned, our preference would be on-site learning for everybody, and to return and to recover to the education provision in Swansea that we know and love. But obviously there are key considerations around building confidence back in our staff, in our workforce, to return to buildings. Because at the start of the year, the main topic, the main headline was that the new variant was potentially creating an unsafe workplace. Obviously, we have evidence now that says the workplace per se is not unsafe, because we know it's the same control measures that we would use for any new variant, or this particular new variant, I should say. And those control measures need to be enhanced, and there needs to be greater focus on the same hierarchy of control measures within our schools. So we do have a lot of work to do to build confidence in staff, both teaching staff, non-teaching staff, everybody associated with the school, really, and also their associations, their trade unions. We will need to build that confidence back. Now, we are meeting with Welsh Government tomorrow and a week tomorrow to start planning. You'll have heard already that Scotland is starting to plan a return to education. And much as Scotland has announced that it will be a non-binary decision, there will be considerations about how we stagger the return to education and the recovery from this current period. So some of the considerations we anticipate in our discussions with the Welsh Government will be around the age groups that return first. So if you recall the fire break at the end of October, start of November, it was clear that younger children were kept in school, and then the ones in years 9 and above went to remote learning. But on this occasion, there may be merit to invite the exam year groups in, so that they can cover their curriculum, their syllabuses, and to ensure that they have good opportunities. So we'll see how that plays out in terms of year groups. The other consideration, of course, is that we know that the national R rate for the coronavirus has to drop significantly. We don't have an R rate for Swansea, so but we know that some other authorities have obviously got significant cases still. We know from our perspective that the number of cases is in decline in our patch of the world. So there may be consideration around geography and the health board footprints in the future that may come into our considerations when we enter into discussions with Welsh Government. So obviously what Welsh Government have pledged to do is talk to the profession, to listen and to understand rather than make snap decisions. It's very difficult obviously in a pandemic to have any kind of planning or strategy in place because everybody's at the mercy of the virus. But where possible, Welsh Government want to work with education colleagues to make sure that people are listened to and for those considerations to be put into their plans for returning. So at this stage, if there is no significant drop in the R rate nationally, we anticipate that schools in Swansea will not return until the 22nd of February, which is the first Monday after half term. So what that looks like currently, we have no idea, and we'll update you as soon as we find out. In terms of building confidence back in staff as well, you will know that vaccination is a key theme for everybody at the moment. I think everybody would like to be vaccinated. And obviously there is a petition, I think last weekend, it reached more than 16,000 signatures for the SENED for teachers to be vaccinated. Obviously they're not currently in the national plan for vaccination in Wales, and that obviously the criteria is determined by an independent body to the UK government and the constituent parts. So we have had an indication that our staff working with vulnerable children where intimate care is required can be vaccinated. It hasn't happened yet, but we are trying to push that agenda to make sure it happens as soon as possible. So we have staff in our special schools. We also have specialist teaching facilities where they're working with profound and multiple learning difficulty pupils. And potentially also our pupil referral unit is working with some challenging pupils that staff may benefit from having a vaccination because of almost the social care they have to provide. And indeed, it's a key concern of ours to make sure that some of our workforce, where appropriate, can receive that vaccination. So in terms of our other priorities in education, then I'll finish and answer questions. Obviously, we've got 7 key priorities in education that we are currently working on, and they haven't taken a rest because of COVID. They may have been disrupted because of COVID in some part. But our key priorities, obviously, safeguarding is one in education, not just to have safe buildings in our estate, but also to keep pupils safe. So the vigilance we would have when schools are pupils are in schools, we've lost that. So it is a concern. The only thing that keeps me awake at night is thinking about our vulnerable children and the families and what they're enduring in terms of their ability to cope at the moment. So we are keeping a close eye really and working with social services to make sure that we know that schools are engaging on a wellbeing pastoral front with families and keeping a close eye on some of those children. Our second priority then is around our buildings programme to ensure that we have fit for purpose 21st century buildings, the right schools in the right place at the right time. And we know that the handover of our new PRU, Maestero, will occur next week in terms of the handover of keys from the construction company to the head teacher essentially of the PRU. So that's really good news, and a number of other programmes have been highlighted in today's press. Councillor Rayner will elaborate no doubt on some of those programmes in a minute, but it's featured today in the press. We have an additional learning needs strategy in Swansea, and there is no let-up in terms of Welsh Government asking to revise any timelines with our additional learning needs other than post-16. So you'll know that the new ALN strategy encompasses the ages of 0 to 25. And we expect that we have to implement a new act in Swansea by this September. So there are high expectations. There are 11 key aims that we are working towards within that strategy. And in our Swansea strategy, we are working very close with partners to ensure that we are in a good position to drive that forward. We also have a key strategy around blended learning. So you'll know that we have a continuity of learning plan for COVID, but further to that, it's underpinned by our key priority to make sure that teaching and learning is the best it can be in Swansea. So we have plans and policies that we are maturing in that respect. We have a positive behaviour strategy and implementation plan. And every school has a policy for positive behaviour. That's been very difficult to embed when schools have become disrupted because of COVID. But it is a key priority for us to make sure that policy is embedded in every school. And hopefully when we return to normal times, we can see the benefits of that. We also have a curriculum development strategy, or a curriculum development implementation plan, I should say. And interestingly, Welsh Government are about to publish their curriculum implementation plan on a national footing, but Swansea was first. So we produced ours, and ours spans 2019 to 2022. So that curriculum implementation plan in Swansea, it's reaching, I think it's third phase of activity for us. And there are professional learning opportunities still being afforded around curriculum design through our local authority officers and our regional partners in Aero. So that hasn't taken a rest either. There is an expectation that the new curriculum will start to be implemented in 2022. So that's a year in September. And finally then, our 7th priority, I think I've covered 7 of them, is to improve our leadership capacity across our schools in Swansea. And you will know by now, we have a national programme in Wales to develop leaders on all kinds of tiers. So that is delivered by our key delivery partner, by the consortium that is currently Aero. And we hope that will continue regardless of the new consortium arrangements that are being planned currently. That national programme will be in place, and that our leaders, prospective leaders, our aspiring leaders, our middle leaders, any leader in Swansea in a school can access those professional opportunities and benefit from them.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. Before I ask Jen to come in, are there any questions to Helen? Here we go, Al.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I just a quick question about the latest newsletter, and I noticed that it says that there's still a significant amount of PDG lack still unclaimed by schools, and that will be redistributed. I wonder if you could share, if you're able to, what the rationale or what the methodology for redistributing those funds would be, in terms of, you know, what would be the plan.
As far as I know, the PDG LAC is distributed on more or less a cluster basis. So I'd be interested to know if any schools have not entered into a kind of partnership and work together around that. And certainly we would seek to redistribute within the partnership, within a cluster first. So I don't know who's not claimed, so it's difficult for me to say if it's one cluster or across a range of clusters, but our distribution would be to maintain it within the cluster.
I see, yeah. So if I understand correctly, although it says it's significant, that's just a relative term. No, we're not quite sure what that means in monetary terms or proportion of the actual grant. And if it goes to the cluster, then it'll just be some ad hoc arrangement within clusters, how that gets distributed, as they'll agree amongst themselves. I'm just wondering, do clusters have cluster leads as such? I'm not quite sure how clusters work with decision making along those lines.
Yeah, for LAC children, there should be a key worker in every school, for want of a better word. I'm not saying they're called key workers. It could be a pastoral deputy in a secondary. It could be something else in a primary school. But those leads should be working together, and they may have spent the money already, but they just haven't claimed it. So we need to unpack it. We need to make sure. And in some instances, they may have activities that just are ongoing and just need a final push before they're putting an invoice in. But I would expect that they are attributed to one key person in a school that monitors the provision for looked after children in their school. And the opportunity to collaborate within a cluster is always there, and to pool resources, because very often the money provides some training opportunities. So even for mainstream pupil development grant, one of the key things you can do is to afford whole school training.
Okay.
To help support and understand those who need it the most in terms of deprivation. So in the same vein, LAC PDG can be used in that way as well. Yeah. But the best use of LAC PDG is to ask the learners themselves what they would like from.
I just wondered who would arbitrate claims on that within a cluster. That's all. I'm just wondering what that sort of decision-making structure is. You've got all those key workers in your nomenclature, so you know they'll all have competing interests potentially, and they're all incredibly valid claims on that cash potentially as well. So someone's got to say, right, you can have it and you can't. And I just wondered what that process might be within a cluster.
Yeah, I mean, within a cluster, we'd obviously have to unpack, but we have a monitoring officer from a funding perspective.
Okay.
They're not actually a monitoring officer, it's the wrong term, but they monitor the funding aspects. But we also have a LACES officer, so looked after children education officer, and she will consider really what the expenditure is, what they've spent it on. She may ask to monitor some plans. She may look carefully at what's happening, why it hasn't been spent, and what can be done.
So the authority would effectively determine who would get that money rather than the cluster themselves?
We'd encourage clusters to work together because we should have some oversight really of the practice that's going on in every school. And we'd much prefer that it was shared between the cluster as an opportunity for shared training, that kind of thing. But I can't comment without seeing some of the detail behind it really to say who's not claimed, why they haven't claimed, and what we need to do about it.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know if this is a COVID blip in terms of non-claiming. It's almost similar to underclaiming of council tax relief in my mind. It's that type of thing. Is it at a similar scale? I don't know. So perhaps, Lyndon, I don't know if this is something that the committee might be interested to know if this is something that happens on a regular basis, or is it just this year that there is an underclaim? Because it's an interesting situation. If there's money that's not being claimed, why is that? And you guys within the education department are best suited to be able to determine why they would be in your liaison with those clusters. But I'm just interested in terms of the bigger picture. Is this a trend? Is there something else going on here in terms of visibility? And if they're not drawing down the funds, why would that be, you know?
One thing I would say is that Q4 is symptomatic of the need to remind people to submit things.
Is it? Right. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So we're now in Q4 in the financial year, and very often you'll get an officer who needs to get things done and sewn up and just needs to nudge people. Yes, very often, some of these claims actually do come in between now and March.
Right. So just sitting on desks.
Yeah, I don't think it's a huge worry. I think it's more it's born out of an officer being diligent.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you very much.
A couple of hands up here. Mike, and then Cyril, and then Jen.
Yeah, assume it's Mike Day rather than Mike Dirk.
Mike. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Mike.
Mike was looking shocked. The other Mike was looking shocked. Then.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sure that I'm speaking on behalf of the whole committee, Helen, when I just would express my thanks to you and to all the education school-based staff for dealing with this very challenging situation. And I'd hope that in some way, again, Lyndon, we could convey our thanks to all those involved. It's a very challenging situation, obviously one that never has been experienced before, but I'd like to thank everybody for the work they've been doing. The 2 points that I'd like to raise, one was just in connection with the challenge of communicating expectations in relation to how teaching is going to take place, how learning is supported. And I think we probably all had experiences where parents have been saying, you know, my child is not being given enough work, or I'm unclear as to what the child is expected to do. And comments from children that say, I'm being given too much work, you know, from the same family, as it were. So it's really, I suppose, in a sense, that challenge of, you know, how we support teachers and schools in communicating to parents, you know, what the expectations are. We're not clearly going to be able to provide a full diet of online teaching every day for the whole of the day. And I think, you know, some of the parents are thinking still that what we're doing simply is replacing the face-to-face contact with online teaching. So, you know, I would like to sort of add my weight, as it were, to kind of any discussions that would be taking place in relation to communicating with parents and getting that message over in as many ways as we can about what their children can expect. The second is the pressures that, I mean, we've heard of the considerable pressures on health staff and social care staff, and you know, I think we're all very conscious of that, but we don't hear so much about actually the pressures that are on teaching and education support staff, because we do recognise that, and I know from personal experience, having a daughter and son-in-law who are in teaching, what the pressures are in terms of being able to convey the information, not just in terms of online teaching, but also in preparing packs, and also then in terms of you know, potentially doing one-to-one work almost. So the question I have in relation to that is, we've talked about it before, but again, what resources would you need in order to ensure that there is appropriate support for those teachers who are finding it tough going, and not just in terms of professional support, which I'm sure is there through you and your colleagues, but also, for want of a better phrase, you know, counselling in relation to dealing with the pressures and the mechanisms that are in place. We've heard that already as a committee, so I don't need to kind of re-emphasise that, but I wondered whether from your perspective and your colleagues' perspective, if there's additional resources that might be required in future to provide that type of support.
Certainly, if I start with the first element, Councillor Day, and obviously the communication with parents, it's a question we've pondered this week. It is a matter of balance, isn't it? It's a matter of what suits a particular school and a particular age group. And it shouldn't be a postcode lottery. There should be a minimum expectation that children across Swansea receive a good, suitable learning offer and an accessible learning offer according to their age and aptitude. Now, that's really, really difficult to achieve and to articulate what it looks like. What I would say is that our local authority guidance on blended learning is the higher ground for any leader in a school to communicate with their parent and say, we have suitable plans and policies and guidance from the local authority and indeed from the Education Consortia ERO. So we've got a blended learning guide on both fronts. In the absence of any national expectations, we've got our regional and local guide clearly articulated. Now, to prescribe, from my perspective as an interim director, there's no way I could write to parents and say, this is what you're going to get, because it wouldn't be fair to our leaders. It wouldn't be fair to the different communities they serve, because of you know, the different needs in terms of language needs, accessibility needs. So you know, I'm not putting our school leaders out to dry and saying, oh, it's up to you to communicate to parents. What I'm giving them is the tools to allow their staff really to benefit from good, clear guidance, and then to decide what the balance is for their school and for their learners. So it's up to really schools to communicate that, but we will support them with the tools to do that job. And then on the second matter you raised, this again is something we've pondered this week internally as a department and in consultation with our consultative head teachers who we meet regularly. So we've got the chairs of the primary forum and the chair of the secondary forum. And they raised this matter in terms of accessing counselling services, not just for our teachers, but indeed for our school leaders as well. So we've made our position clear. We've diligently, actually today, provided a good list really of the resources available in Swansea and how those can be accessed when the time is right for people who need it. So we are keeping a close eye on that, because you're right in pointing out it's a juggling act. It's been relentless in terms of chopping and changing expectations. It's a very difficult and volatile environment to be working in, and it will erode mental health. I mean, the fact that we've had a very wet January, and we're trying to work and juggle in different ways, and to provide some online on-site learning and then off-site online learning. You know, the parameters are varied and changing, so it's very difficult. And I think anything we can do to support that agenda, we will from the Education Directorate, and make it really clear about where to go. But it's not just about signposting, because I know Councillor Rayner often says that signposting can be just a waste of time and almost abdicating your duty and saying, well, just go there. But really, we're doing more than that. We're actually offering sessions. Last term, we offered through our educational psychology, our principal psychologist offered a positive psychology model that would be helpful in a crisis, and that was delivered to our leaders in schools, and it's a model that can be shared then amongst staff. We've also had opportunities through the National Academy for Leadership in Wales, where they've afforded headspace opportunities to allow leaders in particular to meet together in discrete fora to allow them to discuss matters that are concerning them. And in terms of our teachers, there's the Education Support Partnership, which is endorsed by Welsh Government, and that provides a free and confidential helpline to anybody working in the field of education across Wales. And that has a Welsh medium offer as well. So it's not just an English medium, so you can pick up the phone. And they indeed have offered opportunities for practitioners to meet confidentially, discuss their concerns. So there's a wide spectrum really of professional help, softer opportunities. So I think we've got a lot of it covered really.
I think that's really helpful. But just as a brief follow-on, is it possible for you to utilize the blended learning that you mentioned earlier?
The blended learning guidance, yes?
Yes, please, yeah.
Yes, certainly. And also in our newsletter to all schools next week, we will be giving them the full list of counselling opportunities and referral opportunities available.
Great, thanks very much, Helen.
Thank you.
Well, I mentioned two mics. There's only one Cyril, and he's next.
Thank you, Chair. My question is, Ellen, going on one of the 7 commitments, ALN, I think you know where I'm going to be coming from there. Can you tell me if the time for assessing a child with needs has come down? I know it might still stay the same because of COVID, but is there any chance of it coming down, the assessment times?
At this time, our health colleagues are very pressured and pressurised, so I can't comment really on whether that pathway timescale has improved in terms of the waiting list. I did respond to you in writing, Councillor Anderson, didn't I, before? So I would have to go back and check with health colleagues and provide that answer outside the meeting.
Great, thank you. The next person then with a hand up is Jen, and then the other Mike Dirk. Jen.
Thank you, Lyndon. Can I just follow on from what Mike Day was saying about the enormous stresses teachers are under at the present time? And I also make the same comment about all the staff in the education department and other council departments. Staff have often had to be redeployed to support other important things like TTP, etc. And I think it's beholden on all of us, including myself, to just bear in mind the pressure everyone is under. And I mean, a number of occasions I've had to stop myself sending an email. I've had to say to officers, whoa, it's 7:30 on a Friday, go and do something else, switch off. Everyone has to be encouraged to have some recovery time. And I would ask all councillors to just bear this in mind. A couple of weeks ago, we had another councillor who wrote in, who almost elevated to a complaint that he hadn't had an immediate response about access of one of his residents to the childcare situation. Well, not everything can be answered within a couple of hours. You might clock on to that point in the evening where somebody has just said, I'm going to switch off and have something to eat, because it's really difficult putting that in. So I'm aware there are, as Helen has summarised, a number of professional offers. And I think we should say to the education staff, use them if you feel the need to have them. Thankfully now we can all talk about mental pressures much more than we used to do. At one time it was just a sign of weakness. Oh, you can't cope. Well, you shouldn't be coping. If you are coping, something's gone wrong. You're pretending you're coping. You're missing something. So, you know, sympathy to all the staff, and ask all councillors for a little bit of leeway when they get back to me and say, I wrote this email yesterday and I haven't had a reply. And my response will be, you'll have to wait a week, because what you're asking isn't one of those key priorities. On the plus side, I think many of our staff and schools have been much heartened by the Eston report that came out beginning of the week last week. Helen will correct me, with a number of cameos in from Swansea schools. And although I'd read the draft before Christmas, reading it again in the middle of the next phase of lockdown made me realise how well prepared we were, because we weren't starting from blank. The scheme was there, we're putting it in progress. And I think all of us on reading that report thought, oh, good old Swansea, excellent. So I don't know if Helen's going to touch on that at all, or if at a future meeting, Scrutiny would like to go through that in detail.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Jen. I think, thanks very much. Yeah, and I appreciate the work of the staff, and it's always nice as well when you do get those replies to say, as we all do, a big thank you as well, because I think that is vitally important. And you know, everybody's going that extra mile and sometimes doing jobs that are totally different, and that brings its own pressures, because you've got the learning curve as well. So no, absolutely. Could we get Mike in next first, and then we can circle back to Helen? Mike Dirk, that is.
Yeah, thanks, Lyndon. Thank you, Chair. I thought I'd better say something because I've heard my name quite a lot. Yeah. No, can I say that last week we had a Universities Wales Civic Mission Showcase. So universities across Wales were part of this with the Minister, and this focus on getting higher education, university education, in some sense, sort of out of ivory tower thinking, and getting closer to our education colleagues at every level. And there are opportunities there. There seems to be a concerted drive to really revisit the civic mission for universities, to make sure that universities are rooted in the life of our communities and step in with us in Swansea and all the other local authorities in Wales to really spread a value in of education. So more and more people understand what opportunities exist for them. So I think the other point I would want to make is that that's a genuine offer that has been taken very seriously. It's the end game, isn't it? You know, that's where we end up getting to university or further and higher education towards the end of our academic careers. And the other thing in that context I'd like to add value to is the importance of working with children and young people to realise that the COVID crisis is not the end of the world. We forget what it's like being a teenager and how much stress and pressure that comes from all sorts of avenues. And of course, the disruption they've experienced has been shattering. And so I'd like to sort of extend a bit of an offer that if you want a sounding board for any ideas of how we can clarify some of the realities of further and higher education, I know that myself and colleagues are on hand to provide that reassurance for 15 and 16-year-olds who are moving on through GCSEs and beyond at such an unsettling time for them. There's not a question, Chair. I just wanted to add, but I add that comment because I think it's in keeping with what we've heard from the Cabinet Member, from Jenna, and of course from Helen and others as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Louis. Important point. Helen.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. If I go back to Councillor Rayner's point on the Estin report first, and then I'll address what Councillor Dirk just mentioned next after that. So in terms of the Estin report, I know that Michelle Roberts has been able to share that report with you, the link to the main national report by Estin, and indeed our letter in Swansea, which provided a range of further cameos exemplifying how we had responded to the pandemic in two phases, really. The first part from March to August, and then from September and during the best part of last term. So I think it would be a good opportunity for that report to be considered when you have time further, and for us to look at it again in a panel if that's something you would want to do, because the themes within that report around the support for vulnerable children, the leadership and the communication and the support received by schools across Swansea are very critical themes, really, that haven't gone away. We're still working with those themes this term and may have to do so next term. And it's really important that we examine those themes well, and in particular the support to vulnerable children, I would say, because as time has gone on, they are the ones who are potentially going to suffer the most out of this. And then for Councillor Dirk's benefit, one thing that was published yesterday was the Commissioner's, the Children's Commissioner in Wales, her Coronavirus and Me survey. Now, she produced one last May, which we responded to from a Swansea perspective, and we received a report across a range of age groups telling us what children and young people thought about the pandemic and the lockdown in the first phase. Now, that survey has been launched yesterday, but it's got a very tight timescale in terms of when it closes. So it does actually close, I think, a week tomorrow. So we've put it out to our schools today and to our third sector partners as well to make sure that it's widely shared. So if you are a governor in a school, please raise some awareness around this, because that data is really important. It will help us plan. It's something we can share in terms of intelligence with you, Councillor Dirk, from a HE perspective, from a higher education perspective, because certainly we'll have a rich seam of information about the perspectives of young people, what it means to them, and how we can adjust our planning and our recovery in Swansea, not just from a school's perspective, but in terms of their future and higher education. So I think that's something really important.
Great, thank you very much. Certainly, the Estin report is something that we can certainly consider. And I know certainly at the last meeting when we met people from the Skills Partnership and the work that had been done around digital, and I know looking at Mike Dirk, that is, and it was Miles Langston, but we had three of us sit on the Education PDC, and we did a lot of work around that initially, and it was very pleasing to see that that work come into fruition. In fact, I felt quite proud about the work that had actually happened, and you know, your members from your department who came along and sort of said that what they were doing and how they were implementing it to get other people to get involved with that, I think is something that we can be quite proud of. But certainly those points taken on board. Any other questions to Helen or to Jen? No hands up. That's all. Right. Oh, Jen, you've got your hand up. Have you? Or no? Yes, you have.
Sorry,
You're
can
on
I
it.
just go back to the LAC PDCs and the clusters?
Yeah.
All schools are in clusters, and all schools should have a LAC governor as well. So that's often the first point of call. If you haven't got a LAC governor on your school governing body, it might be because you've never had any LAC children, but you really need to have one nominated should any looked after children appear, because it's that person is the essential link between governors and the LAC teachers within the school. The other issue is the LAC PDC is not the same as the PDC. The PDC gets paid to the consortium and gets turned around pretty swiftly on the numbers who qualify on the January figures. The LAC PDC is retained by the consortia, and I have to say the consortium across Wales do some excellent work with that. And then there is an extra sum which is distributed out to the schools. And in Swansea, we do that via the cluster approach, because it's no use giving every school a tiny sum. It's better doing it collectively, because we found that across a number of changes that is better, and we really are encouraging cluster work. So, Mr. Roberts, I think you would be in the Bishopston cluster. And that's a good place to be, because they do lots of excellent work. And I know you also in that cluster, there's a range of primary schools from South Gower that also come into it. So that's a starting place to look at how cluster funding is being allocated within that cluster for the purposes. And that there are a number of funding streams. I'm not sure about the LAC PDC, but certainly the catch-up funding and any PDG funding, where the governors have to put that on a public notice as part of their overall perspective of the schools. So it's a good thing to make sure if everyone is actually sort of following the rules and regs down at school level.
Councillor, I think that's a brilliant point, and thank you for coming back to my point about that. Yes, of course, every governing body, like our own, has a LAC governor too, and that notice was in the newsletter, which is going out to all governing bodies. Now, if schools, but you know, the head teachers are typically the people representing the school within clusters, to the best of my knowledge. The LAC governor won't be sitting at cluster meetings, to the best of my knowledge. So it was just a little bit not surprising, but you know, if schools clusters like South Gower are not applying for this, then there's obviously some kind of communication breakdown, and I'm not sure I'm the person best fit to try and dig into what that communication breakdown is, to be honest. And we won't be the only school that will be suffering with this. So I think it's really interesting that you've shed the light on what the expectation that is there, and that there's a role for governors to play, I think you were saying, perhaps I'm paraphrasing, in order to represent at the cluster level to say we need this. So, but typically governors aren't involved in cluster meetings. I know I'm not, as chair of governors down at Bishopston, I'm not typically involved in the cluster meeting. So maybe there's a disconnect there, and maybe there's a structural issue that we need to look at exactly how those decision-making processes are operating in practice. And you're right, perhaps there's something that needs highlighting.
I think that would be worth pursuing, because I'm in a different cluster, North Gower cluster, which has always worked extremely closely, especially on that critical element of moving from primary to secondary. And school governors have always played a role in that, going along to any moderation sessions, looking at the work that other schools have brought forward. So yes, if you can widen the role of governors to play a more active role, positive role in cluster working, it can be very beneficial, and it's an excellent sharing of good practice.
Perhaps I could contact you privately or offline then to find out exactly what the mechanisms are that you enjoy in North Gower that perhaps we're not enjoying in South Gower. Would that be okay?
That would be fine.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Any other questions at all? No? No, great. Well, thank you very much. The next item on the, and could I say thanks to Jen for answering all those questions, in particular Helen. And gosh, you seem to have a great depth of knowledge. Fair play to you, because you were sort of firing at everybody was firing questions, and you were coming back with great knowledge. So thank you very much. The next item on the agenda is the work programme, and Michelle, would you like to come in?
Hello, yes. The next meeting is on the 16th of February, and it will be the budget as far as it relates to education. The papers will be published on the Thursday, but the actual cabinet papers won't be published to the Friday. So I'll send the agenda out, and I'll send a link to the papers. It's just the way that it works out with publishing dates and for cabinet. But that will be your next meeting.
Great, thanks. And on that, when we get those papers, could we have a look at those and highlight any questions? Obviously, you have the opportunity on the day to bring questions, but if we can give Helen advance warning of some of those questions, that would be helpful, and helpful to us as well, because she will be able to give a more in-depth answer then, rather than off the cuff on a very hefty document. So any help we can give Helen on that would I know be gratefully received by her. So it's any questions around that? No, great, excellent. Well, thank you all very much for attending, and look forward to seeing you, if not before, in February at our February meeting. Keep safe.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
It's all going so fast. Thank you very much, Lyndon. Goodbye.
See you, Jen.